Mark Ellison and his wife Clara seemed like the perfect suburban couple, but when Clara's sister Hannah moved in, a secret affair ignited a chain of betrayal that would shatter their family and lead to a deadly cover-up no one could have imagined. Please subscribe for daily new update of crime story and watch till end. In the quiet suburb of Ohio, Mark Ellison and his wife Clara lived in a home that many would envy. Their two-story brick house sat at the end of a cul-de-sac, framed by a well-kept lawn and trimmed hedges. To neighbors, they were the perfect family. Mark with his steady job as a financial consultant, Clara devoted to raising their teenage son Ethan, and weekends filled with barbecues and cheerful gatherings. The Ellisons appeared to have achieved the suburban dream, where smiles came easily and problems seemed too small to matter. But behind the closed doors of their house, the reality was far more complicated. Mark often felt the pressure of maintaining the image they had built, and Clara, while loving and committed, was sometimes consumed by the endless responsibilities of motherhood and household duties. What others saw as perfect harmony was, in truth, a delicate balance hiding small cracks that were beginning to spread. Mark carried himself with confidence in public, admired for his discipline and sharp appearance, but at home, the charm he displayed for clients and friends often faded into quiet detachment. He loved his family, but there was a lingering sense of dissatisfaction he struggled to put into words. Clara, on the other hand, was admired by the community for her kindness and warm personality. She volunteered at local events, was active in church, and always showed up at Ethan's school functions with a smile. She was proud of the life she had built with Mark and never suspected that her trust might one day be betrayed. For Ethan, the Ellison home was his world. He was a bright and curious teenager who idolized his father and adored his mother. He believed his parents had everything under control, and he looked forward to the security of their home after long days at school. Like many children his age, he never questioned the foundation of his family, unaware that adults often hid their own struggles under a polished exterior. Neighbors looked at the Ellisons as the kind of family everyone wished they had. At block parties, Clara always brought the best homemade dishes, and Mark entertained with stories about his work and travels. When other parents faced challenges, Clara offered support, often lending a hand without expecting anything in return. To outsiders, there was no reason to suspect that anything was wrong inside their home. Yet even in these moments of togetherness, Mark sometimes drifted into his own thoughts, imagining a life that felt more thrilling, more alive than the one he currently lived. It was in these quiet moments of restlessness that the seeds of betrayal were first planted. Mark did not realize it at the time, but the discontent he carried was slowly eroding the foundation of his marriage. Clara noticed his distance now and then, but she brushed it off as stress from work. She trusted him completely and never questioned his loyalty. This unwavering trust became the very reason she would later feel the deepest pain. Their lives, outwardly so stable, were balancing on a fragile line. No one in the neighborhood, not even Clara herself, could see how close the Ellisons were to a storm that would tear their family apart. When Clara's younger sister Hannah Parker showed up at their doorstep, her life was in shambles. She had just ended a messy relationship that left her with no place to live and very little money to rebuild. Clara, being the protective older sister she had always been, immediately offered her home as a safe refuge. To Clara, family meant everything, and letting Hannah stay was not only the right thing to do but also something she believed would strengthen their bond. Hannah arrived with just a couple of suitcases and an exhausted smile, grateful to have a place where she was welcomed without judgment. Mark carried her bags inside, shaking his head at the chaos but agreeing it was temporary. After all, he trusted Clara's judgment and wanted to support her decisions. At first, everything seemed innocent enough. Hannah blended quickly into their household routines. She helped Clara with cooking, cleaning, and even running errands. Her presence brought a different kind of energy into the home. She was younger, more carefree, and often made jokes that lightened the mood. Ethan grew fond of his aunt's company, seeing her as a fun and lively addition to the household. To neighbors, it was just another example of the Ellisons being a supportive family. What no one could see was the subtle shift beginning to unfold. Mark, though polite and distant at first, soon found himself paying more attention to Hannah. She was different from Clara in ways that stirred something inside him. Where Clara was cautious and organized, Hannah was impulsive and adventurous. She had a way of carrying herself that reminded Mark of the excitement he once craved but rarely felt anymore. Clara noticed the positive side of Hannah's presence. Her sister's help gave her moments of rest she hadn't enjoyed in years. With Hannah around, Clara finally had time to catch up on her hobbies, reconnect with friends, and even take a few evenings for herself. To her it was a blessing. Another reason to be grateful that family would always be there when needed. She never once considered that Hannah's presence could become a threat to her marriage. Clara trusted both her husband and her sister with her whole heart, unaware of the storm that was quietly building beneath the surface. As days turned into weeks, Hannah and Mark found themselves in small, casual interactions that grew increasingly personal. Late at night, when Clara went to bed early, Hannah would often stay up watching television in the living room. Mark, unable to sleep after long hours of work, sometimes joined her. They exchanged conversations that began innocently enough: movies, current events, stories from their pasts. Slowly, these talks carried a spark of tension, a subtle awareness of being closer than they should be. They laughed at each other's jokes, shared small secrets, and lingered in silence longer than necessary. Each night they spent together blurred the boundaries a little more. What seemed like a harmless arrangement, the kindness of one sister helping another, was in fact the quiet start of something dangerous. The Ellison home, once a sanctuary of family unity, was now carrying an invisible fracture. Clara still felt safe in her decision, certain she had done the right thing, while Hannah and Mark were standing at the edge of choices that would forever alter their lives. What began as harmless late-night conversations slowly turned into something far more dangerous. At first, Mark convinced himself it was nothing, just companionship during quiet hours when Clara had already gone to bed. Hannah seemed to understand him in ways Clara hadn't in years. She listened without judgment, laughed at his jokes, and offered a spark of excitement he had long been missing. The thrill of those moments was intoxicating. Soon a line was crossed, and once crossed, it could never be undone. A brush of hands while passing popcorn turned into lingering touches, and those lingering touches became stolen kisses in the shadowy corners of the house. Mark told himself he was in control, that it was temporary, that no one would ever find out, but the secrecy only fed the fire. Every time he looked at Clara, guilt gnawed at him, yet the guilt wasn't strong enough to stop him. Hannah, on the other hand, embraced the danger. For her, the affair carried the thrill of rebellion and the comfort of being desired after a painful breakup. She justified it by convincing herself that she deserved happiness, even if it came in a forbidden form. What neither of them admitted, even to themselves, was how destructive their choices would become. The stolen moments grew riskier. A quick embrace in the kitchen when Clara was upstairs. A shared glance across the dinner table, loaded with hidden meaning. Even the simple act of Hannah laughing at something Mark said in Clara's presence carried a secret weight. Every move was a gamble, but that only made it more exhilarating. They felt alive in the secrecy, blind to the fact that each step pushed them closer to disaster. Clara remained unaware, though subtle cracks in her marriage had already begun to appear. Mark grew more distracted, often checking his phone at odd times, his eyes lighting up at messages he claimed were from work. Hannah grew quieter around her sister, careful not to let her guard slip, but her avoidance only made the air in the house heavier. The trust Clara had always carried so naturally was now being tested in ways she couldn't yet see. The more they indulged, the harder it became to stop. The affair shifted from brief encounters to a consuming obsession. Mark began to find excuses to stay home during the day, working remotely when he could just to steal time with Hannah. She lingered in the house, long past when she should have started planning her next steps in life. Neither of them considered the consequences of being discovered. They were too entangled in the thrill to imagine the fallout. What had started as whispers in the dark had become a full-blown secret that threatened the foundation of the Ellison family. Every lie told, every cover-up, every reckless choice was another stone laid on the path to ruin. The affair was no longer a passing mistake. It was an unstoppable force, one that would soon demand a price far higher than either of them could bear. Clara couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. At first, it was tiny things, a fleeting glance between Mark and Hannah that seemed loaded with meaning, a sudden awkward silence when she entered a room. She brushed it off, telling herself she was overthinking, that maybe the stress of daily life was making her paranoid. But as days passed, the unease grew harder to ignore. She noticed Mark coming home later than usual, claiming extra meetings or errands that didn't add up. Texts would buzz on his phone at odd hours, and he would quickly hide the screen whenever she walked by. The small inconsistencies, once easy to dismiss, now accumulated into a heavy weight on her chest. Hannah's behavior also began to shift. She avoided sitting too close to Clara or making eye contact when the conversation turned personal. She offered vague answers to simple questions, smiled too brightly, or laughed at moments that weren't funny. Clara had always been perceptive, and these changes triggered a quiet alarm in her mind. She started paying closer attention to the interactions between her husband and sister, looking for clues that might confirm the nagging suspicion she couldn't yet name. Despite her growing doubts, Clara tried to maintain a normal routine. She focused on Ethan, her son, and the household chores that had always kept her busy. She reminded herself of the trust she had in her husband and the love that had built their family over the years. Yet, every time she caught a subtle exchange between Mark and Hannah, a hand lingering a second too long on the counter, an almost imperceptible shared smile, her heart sank a little more. The seeds of unease had taken root, and they were growing faster than she could control. Clara started noticing patterns she couldn't ignore. Mark's excuses for staying late at work or running errands alone became more frequent. Hannah's presence in the home, once comforting, now felt like a looming shadow. The more she observed, the more she realized that the energy in the house had changed. It was no longer a warm, welcoming home. There was tension beneath every surface, a current of secrecy that she could feel even when nothing overt was happening. Late at night, when the house was quiet, Clara replayed moments in her mind. She thought about the times Mark had been unusually attentive to Hannah, about the private conversations she had overheard, and about the way her sister's laughter sometimes seemed directed at someone else. Her gut told her that something serious was happening, something that threatened the very foundation of the family she had worked so hard to build. The realization was terrifying, but Clara also felt a quiet determination. She would uncover the truth, no matter how painful it might be. Trust had been the cornerstone of her marriage, and now she understood that she could no longer accept things at face value. Something hidden was growing in the shadows, and Clara knew that when the truth finally emerged, it would shatter the fragile balance of her world. The unease she had felt was no longer a whisper. It was a storm gathering, one that would soon break over the life she thought she knew. Clara had tried to convince herself that she was imagining things, that the strange tension in her home was just a product of stress. But the evidence was undeniable when she stumbled across Hannah's scarf in the back seat of Mark's car. It was a scarf Clara had never seen before, soft and feminine, with a subtle scent that made her stomach twist. Her hands trembled as she reached for Mark's phone, her heart pounding in her chest. She had hesitated for weeks, unsure if she wanted to uncover the truth, but the discovery left her no choice. The messages she found confirmed her worst fears, carefully hidden verses between Mark and Hannah, full of intimacy, desire and secrets meant to be kept from her. Every word felt like a knife cutting through her trust and love. Clara's world crumbled in that instant. She had spent years building a life she thought was secure, only to realize that the people she loved most were the ones who had betrayed her. She remembered small incidents she had previously dismissed, the lingering touches, the hushed laughter, the unexplained late nights. Everything now fit into a horrifying pattern. The sense of safety she had taken for granted was gone, replaced by a gnawing anger and heartbreak that left her breathless. For days Clara observed Mark and Hannah more closely. She watched their interactions, noting every glance, every touch that seemed too intimate. Each instance confirmed what she already knew. The betrayal was not a mistake, it was deliberate and ongoing. Clara's mind raced with questions about how long it had been happening, how deep their feelings ran, and what this meant for the future of her family. She realized that confronting them would be unavoidable, but she dreaded the consequences. When Clara finally confronted Mark and Hannah, it was not with words, but with a quiet intensity that left the house trembling. Mark tried to deny it at first, insisting that Clara was misinterpreting things, but the evidence in her hands was undeniable. Hannah, too, tried to minimize her role, claiming that it had just been a mistake, a lapse in judgment. But Clara saw through their excuses. She felt the full weight of their betrayal, not just as a wife, but as a sister who had opened her home to someone she trusted implicitly. The anger and hurt were overwhelming, and for the first time, Clara understood that the life she had once known could never be restored. The atmosphere in the house changed immediately. Tension hung like a heavy fog, suffocating and unavoidable. Mark and Hannah's relationship, once secret and hidden, became a toxic presence that dominated every room. Clara moved through the house with caution, every step a reminder of the trust that had been shattered. She began to question everything about her marriage, her sister, and the future that now seemed uncertain. Ethan sensed the change too. His once lively home felt strained and silent. He watched his parents closely, noticing the quiet glances and whispered arguments. The innocence of his teenage world was being replaced with fear and confusion. The discovery had not only revealed betrayal, it had begun to unravel the entire fabric of their family. Clara knew that things could never go back to the way they were. The storm had arrived, and there was no avoiding the consequences that were about to follow. The night that changed everything began quietly, as most tragedies do. The Ellison house, once filled with laughter and warmth, was tense and uneasy. Mark and Hannah had become more careless with their interactions, their secret now heavy with the weight of guilt and fear. Clara, though still recovering from the shock of discovery, remained vigilant, watching their every move. The air in the home felt charged, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. Ethan, sensing the tension, stayed in his room more than usual, headphones on, trying to drown out the uneasy sounds of his fractured family. It started with an argument. What had begun as a small disagreement escalated quickly. Voices, once calm and reasoned, became sharp and aggressive. Mark's frustration and fear collided with Clara's pain and anger, and Hannah, caught in the middle, tried to mediate but only added to the chaos. The heated exchange moved through the living room, into the hallways, and eventually reached the staircase. Every shout, every slam of a door, reverberated through the house. Ethan, terrified, tried to intervene, but his voice was barely a whisper against the rising storm. Then it happened. Clara stumbled near the top of the stairs. Whether it was a push or a misstep, no one could say for certain in that instant. The sound of her fall echoed through the house like a gunshot. Mark rushed forward, shouting her name, and Hannah froze, panic written across her face. Ethan, paralyzed with fear, dialed 911 before he could process what was happening. By the time help arrived, the scene was chaotic. Clara lay at the bottom of the stairs, unconscious and bleeding, her body twisted in a way that made the paramedics' faces pale. Mark immediately claimed it was an accident, insisting that Clara had lost her footing in the heat of the argument. He tried to appear calm, guiding the paramedics while keeping Hannah nearby. But investigators noticed inconsistencies almost immediately. The bruises on Clara's arms suggested she had been grabbed or pushed. The angle of her fall did not match Mark's account. Forensic evidence quietly began to contradict the narrative Mark had so desperately tried to construct. Every detail pointed to something far more sinister than a simple accident. Neighbors gathered outside, drawn by the flashing lights and sirens. Whispers filled the quiet streets, speculation running rampant about what had happened in the Ellison household. Ethan, shaken and tearful, watched as the world he had known began to unravel in front of him. His mother's life, once steady and comforting, now hung by a thread, and the man who had promised to protect her was at the center of the disaster. In the aftermath, the Ellison home was no longer a place of safety. Secrets that had festered in darkness were now exposed by tragedy. Mark and Hannah's reckless choices had led to a night of irreversible consequences. What had started as betrayal and deception had escalated to a deadly turning point, setting the stage for investigations, accusations, and the unraveling of the family's life. The house that once symbolized warmth and security now became a crime scene, a monument to the destructive power of lies. After Clara's fall, the Ellison household became a pressure cooker of fear and deceit. Mark and Hannah quickly realized that their secret could no longer be contained. Panic replaced the thrill that had once fueled their affair, and every move they made was calculated to hide the truth. Mark insisted that the fall had been an accident, a tragic slip during the argument, and Hannah went along, nervously agreeing to corroborate his story. But the lies they wove were fragile, held together only by their desperation and the hope that no one would look too closely. From the beginning, the investigators noticed inconsistencies that didn't add up. The bruises on Clara's arms and the angle of her injuries suggested more than a simple accident. Mark's story seemed rehearsed, too smooth to be entirely honest, and Hannah's testimony lacked conviction. Each small detail was like a crack in the foundation of their story, threatening to collapse the narrative they had so carefully constructed. Forensics quickly became the silent enemy, revealing evidence that contradicted their version of events. Fingerprints, scuff marks, and blood patterns told a story far darker than the one Mark and Hannah tried to present. Behind closed doors, Mark and Hannah's relationship began to fracture under the weight of guilt and fear. They argued in whispers, blaming each other for the disaster that had spiraled out of control. Every text, every message, and every glance carried the risk of exposure. The tension in the house was suffocating, a constant reminder that their deception was teetering on the edge of discovery. They both knew that if the truth came out, prison would be inevitable and their lives would be destroyed. Ethan, observing the strained interactions, became increasingly aware of the cracks in his family. He had already witnessed his mother's fall and the chaos that followed. Now, he noticed the furtive glances, the hushed conversations, and the unspoken tension that hung in every room. Though young, he understood that something was terribly wrong. The innocence of his childhood was slipping away, replaced with fear, confusion, and an overwhelming sense of helplessness. The investigators began to piece together a timeline that painted a damning picture. Mark's calls, his late-night outings, and the suspicious movements of both him and Hannah became focal points. Hannah's fingerprints were discovered in places that contradicted her statements. Witness statements and subtle discrepancies in the evidence began to unravel the story Mark had so carefully told. Each new discovery brought them closer to uncovering the truth, a truth that Mark and Hannah had tried desperately to bury. Even as the investigation tightened, Mark and Hannah continued to maintain appearances in front of friends and neighbors. The facade of normalcy became a performance, a desperate act to hide the storm raging beneath the surface. Every smile, every casual conversation was laced with fear, the knowledge that one misstep could expose everything. The web of lies that had begun as a thrilling secret affair now threatened to consume both of them entirely. The cover-up, which had seemed possible in the early days, now began to collapse under the weight of evidence and suspicion. Mark and Hannah were trapped by their own actions, unable to escape the consequences of betrayal, obsession, and reckless decisions. What had started as a hidden romance had escalated into a criminal case, and the Ellison family, once admired by the neighborhood, was now at the center of a tragic and shocking story. The trial of Mark Ellison and Hannah Parker captivated the community, turning the quiet Ohio suburb into the center of a shocking true crime story. The courtroom was tense every day, filled with neighbors, journalists, and those who had once admired the Ellison family. Mark sat stoically, attempting to appear composed, while Hannah's face flickered between fear and defiance. The prosecution presented the evidence meticulously, The bruises on Clara's arms, the inconsistent accounts, the digital messages that proved the affair, and the forensic evidence from the fall. Every detail painted a picture of betrayal, obsession, and ultimately, murder. Witnesses testified about the atmosphere in the Ellison home, describing the tension, the hushed arguments, and the sudden shifts in Mark and Hannah's behavior. Ethan, forced to confront the nightmare of his fractured family, provided crucial testimony about what he had witnessed on the night of his mother's fall. His voice trembled, but he spoke the truth, recounting the shouting, the fear, and the moments leading up to the tragedy. The jury listened intently, piecing together the events that had led to Clara's death, understanding that what began as a hidden affair had spiraled into something deadly. The defense tried to cast doubt, claiming that Clara's death had been an accident, the result of a misstep during a heated argument. They painted Mark as a loving husband, and Hannah as a troubled sister who had made mistakes but had no malicious intent. Yet the mounting evidence was overwhelming. Digital records, physical evidence, and Ethan's testimony formed a chain of proof that could not be ignored. The thrill and secrecy that had once bound Mark and Hannah now became the very evidence that condemned them. As the trial progressed, the story of betrayal, passion, and tragedy unfolded in vivid detail. The community learned how trust could be shattered in an instant, how desire could blind people to the consequences of their actions, and how a family's life could be destroyed by a series of choices made in secret. Mark's conviction for second-degree murder sent shockwaves through the town, while Hannah's charges for conspiracy and obstruction of justice highlighted her role in both the affair and the attempted cover-up. Justice, though delayed, had caught up with them, yet it could not undo the pain they had caused. For Ethan, the aftermath was devastating. He lost both parents, one to death, the other to prison, and was forced to live with relatives, navigating a world that had suddenly become unfamiliar and frightening. The once stable home that had been filled with laughter and warmth was now empty and silent, reminder of everything that had been lost. The community that had once looked to the Ellisons as a model family now saw them as a cautionary tale, a tragic example of how secrets and betrayal can escalate into irreversible consequences. The story of Mark, Clara, and Hannah became more than a news headline. It became a lesson about human frailty, deception, and the destructive power of hidden desires. The Ellison name, once associated with respectability, became synonymous with scandal and tragedy. Friends and neighbors struggled to reconcile the image they had admired with the reality revealed in court. In the end, what began as a forbidden romance had ignited a chain reaction of betrayal, lies, and ultimately death. The family that once seemed perfect was gone, replaced by a legacy of heartbreak and lost trust. The tragedy left scars not only on those directly involved but on the wider community, reminding everyone that even the most seemingly stable lives can be shattered by secrets hidden in the shadows. The Ellisons' story ended in sorrow, a chilling testament to how passion, betrayal, and deceit can destroy everything a family holds dear.